The fire had taken everything but the memory of heat. Althea Washington stood in the sterile quiet of the emergency shelter, the scent of antiseptic fighting a losing battle against the phantom smell of smoke that clung to her clothes, her hair, her very skin. Her son, Leo, slept on a cot beside her, his small chest rising and falling in the one rhythm that still felt real in a world that had dissolved into ash and sirens. Just 3 days ago, she had a home. It wasn't much. A third-floor apartment with a leaky faucet and neighbors who played their music too loud. But it was a tapestry of their life, woven with Leo's crayon drawings, the chipped mug she drank her morning tea from, the worn armchair where she read to him at night. Now it was a skeletal ruin open to the sky, a wound in the side of the city. All that was left of their world fit into a single Red Cross donation bag at the foot of her cot. She had become a ghost in her own life, haunting the edges of a city that had already forgotten her. It was in this hollowed-out state, this profound and terrifying silence, that a man in a crisp, dark suit found her and handed her a letter that would set her entire world on fire all over again. The letter informed her that a great-great-uncle she never knew existed, a man named Silas Washington, had died and left her his entire estate. A single derelict building in the industrial heart of the city. A sealed printing press that had been silent for over 70 years. And inside its deepest vault, a place no one had entered since the day it was shut, was a fortune valued at $529 million. Hey, before we go any further into this unbelievable story, if you're new here, please consider hitting that subscribe button and turning on notifications so you don't miss what happens next. And drop a comment below, letting us know what city or country you're watching from. We love seeing where our stories reach. Now back to Althea and the impossible inheritance. The man, a lawyer named Elias Vance, with eyes that seemed to hold the dust of forgotten archives, placed a single, heavy key in her palm. It was iron, ornate, and strangely shaped, its teeth unlike any she had ever seen. The weight of it felt less like a promise and more like a burden. She looked from the key to her sleeping son, his face so peaceful in the fluorescent gloom. For him, she had fought for scraps, worked double shifts, and navigated the labyrinth of public assistance. For him, she had endured the quiet indignities of poverty. Now she held a key that represented a number so vast it was abstract, a figure from a world of gods and monsters, not of single mothers in homeless shelters. The contrast was so violent, it made her feel dizzy. Vance spoke in a low, measured tone, his voice a relic from another era. The property has complications, significant tax liens. The city has had its eye on the land for decades, and the building itself is an enigma. He paused, his gaze steady. Silas Washington was a very particular man. He didn't just lock his doors, he made them forget they were ever doors at all. Althea said nothing. Words were a currency she couldn't afford. She could only nod, her fingers closing tightly around the cold iron. That afternoon, she left Leo with a kindly volunteer and took a series of buses across the city. The key a cold weight in her pocket. The neighborhood shifted from struggling to desperate, from neglected to forgotten. And then she saw it. The building didn't just occupy a city block, it consumed it. It was a fortress of soot-stained brick and blackened iron, a monument to a forgotten industrial age. Its windows were bricked over, seamless and dark, giving it the appearance of a blind leviathan sleeping in the urban decay. The main entrance was a colossal archway of carved stone, but the doors within were gone, replaced by a solid wall of rusted, welded steel plate. There were no signs, no graffiti, no indication that it was anything other than a solid block of urban geology. It was a place that actively rejected entry, that radiated a profound and intimidating solitude. Standing before it, Althea felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn wind. The building was more than just abandoned. It felt sealed, like a tomb holding $500 million. She looked at her own reflection in a puddle of grimy rainwater. A woman in donated clothes with smoke in her hair and the geography of exhaustion mapped on her face, and she held the key. The absurdity of it was a crushing weight. She was a queen of ashes given the keys to a stone kingdom. The question, the one that echoed in the vast empty space where her life used to be, was not whether she could open the door, but what would happen if she did. What kind of man builds a fortress not to keep people out, but to keep a secret in? And what kind of secret was worth $529 million? The silence of the street was broken only by the distant wail of a siren, a sound that now felt like the anthem of her life. She was homeless, she was destitute, and she was, impossibly, the heir to a mystery locked in iron and stone. The journey from the fire was over. A new one, into the heart of a sealed and silent darkness, was just beginning. The key felt alien in her hand, a piece of intricate, archaic technology in an age of plastic cards and digital codes. It was a relic, and it belonged to a relic. Althea spent the next day navigating a different kind of ruin, the city's municipal building. It was a place of beige walls, humming fluorescent lights, and the slow, grinding erosion of hope. She was directed from one counter to another, a ghost drifting through a purgatory of paperwork. Each clerk she spoke to regarded her with a practiced, weary indifference. When she finally found the Department of Records and Planning, a thin, severe woman with glasses perched on the end of her nose looked up her property by its lot number. The woman's lips tightened into a thin line. "The old Atlas Printing Works," she said, her voice flat. "That place should have been condemned 30 years ago. It's a blight." She tapped her pen on a thick file. "There are outstanding tax liens amounting to $674,000, plus penalties and interest. The city filed for seizure 2 years ago. The process was stalled by the estate's executor, a Mr. Vance, but it's set to proceed. The demolition is scheduled for next spring." Althea's heart sank. A six-figure debt was as impossible a barrier as a wall of welded steel. The $500 million locked inside might as well have been on the moon. "But it's mine," Althea said, her voice barely a whisper. "The will—" The woman gave her a look that was not quite pity, but a tired acknowledgement of a common, foolish dream. "A will doesn't erase debt, miss. The city gets its due. You'd need a miracle to stop this." That evening, she met Elias Vance in his office, a small, cramped space above a bookstore that smelled of aging paper and leather. Dust motes danced in the single beam of light from a desk lamp, illuminating shelves overflowing with books bound in dark, somber colors. Vance sat behind a massive oak desk, a bulwark against the chaos of the modern world. He listened patiently as Althea recounted her experience at the municipal building, his expression unchanging. "Bureaucracy is a beast of its own making," he said when she finished. "It is designed to move slowly and inexorably in one direction. It is not designed for miracles." He steepled his fingers, his gaze distant. But Silas Washington did not believe in leaving things to chance. He understood the nature of beasts, be they made of concrete or of flesh and blood. Vance rose and pulled a heavy, leather-bound book from a shelf. He laid it on the desk, the cover unadorned except for a single, blind-stamped symbol, a stylized letter A intertwined with a press screw. "He kept journals," Vance explained. "This is one of the few he left in my care. Most of his writings are likely inside the building itself." He opened the book. The pages were filled with dense, elegant script, interspersed with complex mechanical diagrams and astronomical charts. It was the work of a brilliant, obsessive mind. "Silas was a visionary," Vance said, his voice taking on a reverent tone. "His family had been in printing for generations, but he saw the press not just as a tool for commerce, but as an instrument of truth, a way to give voice to the voiceless, to record history unvarnished by power. He believed that what was printed, what was made tangible in ink and paper, held a unique power, a permanence." He turned a page, revealing a detailed architectural drawing of the building's facade. He built the Atlas Printing Works in the 1930s. It was his masterpiece, outfitted with machines of his own design. He prospered, but he also made enemies. He printed pamphlets defending union organizers, exposes on corrupt politicians, histories of marginalized communities. He believed that truth was the only real currency. Vance's finger traced a line on the drawing. Then came the betrayal. His partner, a man named Alistair Garrison, stole his most revolutionary designs and sold them to a rival corporation. Garrison used the profits to build an empire, while Silas was nearly ruined. He won a legal battle, but the damage was done. The world he had tried to enlighten had chosen greed, so he retreated. He turned his press into a fortress and sealed himself away from the world. He never printed another word for the public. Vance looked at Althea, his eyes searching her face. He sealed the building in 1948, welded the doors, bricked the windows. He was last seen walking away from it with a single suitcase. No one has been inside since. He pointed to the strange carvings Althea had noticed around the main archway. On the drawing, they were rendered in perfect detail. They weren't decorative. They were symbols, glyphs. He became obsessed with older forms of knowledge, Vance continued. Cryptography, alchemy, architecture as a form of language. He believed a building could be a lock, and that the right person, the right heir, would know how to find the keyhole. The key in Althea's pocket suddenly felt heavier. It was not for the welded door. That was a decoy, a blunt statement to the world. The real entrance was hidden, a secret whispered in stone. The Garrisons are still around, Vance said, his voice dropping. Their family company, Garrison Global, is one of the most powerful conglomerates in the country. They are the ones lobbying the city to demolish the building. They want to erase that part of their history, and they do not know what Silas left inside. If they find out about you, they will not be idle. Althea felt a tremor of fear. This was no longer just about debt and bureaucracy. It was about a feud that had slumbered for 70 years, a story of truth and betrayal. She was not just an heir, she was a participant, the next move in a game she didn't understand. That night, sleep offered no escape. Her dreams were filled with the groaning of immense machines and the smell of ink. She saw a man with eyes like Elias Vance's, standing in a cavernous hall, watching his life's work go silent. He turned to face her, his expression not of anger, but of profound, patient expectation. He was waiting for her. The next morning she returned to the building, this time with a copy of the architectural drawing from Silas's journal. She ignored the boarded-up storefronts and the creeping decay of the neighborhood, her focus solely on the brick and stone facade. She walked its perimeter, her fingers tracing the cold, rough surfaces, comparing the reality to the drawing. The symbols were there, just as in the journal, weathered by decades of acid rain and neglect, but still visible. They were constellations, phases of the moon, geometric patterns that seemed to have no earthly logic. Leo was in a temporary daycare program, a small mercy that gave her these precious hours. She felt a pang of guilt, leaving him to navigate his own trauma while she chased this ghost story. But the shelter was no future for him. This fortress, this puzzle box left by a phantom ancestor, was the only hope she had. She had to believe in it. As the sun began to set, casting long, distorted shadows across the street, a sliver of golden light hit a specific point on the western wall. For a fleeting moment, one of the carved symbols, a depiction of a solar eclipse, seemed to glow. Althea's breath caught in her throat. Following an instinct she didn't know she possessed, she ran her hand over the brickwork within the glowing circle. One brick felt different. It was smooth, not rough like the others, and it shifted slightly under her touch. Her heart hammered against her ribs. It wasn't a door. It was a secret, a beginning. She had found the keyhole. The discovery of the loose brick sent a jolt of pure, unadulterated adrenaline through her, a feeling so potent it momentarily erased the exhaustion that had been her constant companion. But her elation was quickly tempered by caution. This was not a place to be reckless. The street was deserted, but the city had eyes, bored onlookers, passing patrol cars, the ever-present risk of being seen as a vagrant or a vandal. She pushed the brick back into place, making sure it was flush, and walked away, her mind racing. She needed to return under the cover of darkness. That evening, as she was leaving the shelter to meet Vance, a car pulled up to the curb. It was a long, black sedan, the kind of vehicle that seemed to absorb light and sound, its windows tinted to an impenetrable darkness. The back window glided down, revealing a man in his late 60s, his face a mask of patrician confidence, his silver hair perfectly coiffed. He wore a suit that was likely worth more than everything Althea had ever owned. Ms. Washington, he said, his voice smooth and cold, like polished stone. It was not a question. My name is Arthur Garrison. I believe our families have a history. Althea froze, her hand clutching the strap of her bag. This was him, the patriarch, the inheritor of the betrayal. Beside him sat a younger man, likely his son or a lawyer, with the same sharp features and an expression of undisguised impatience. I understand you've come into possession of the old Atlas property, Arthur Garrison continued, his tone casual, as if discussing a minor real estate transaction. It's a worthless ruin, a liability. The city's going to tear it down. My company has an interest in the land for a new logistics hub. He smiled, a thin predatory curving of the lips. We are prepared to be generous. We will clear the outstanding tax liens and offer you a sum, say $50,000, for you to sign over the deed. A fresh start for you and your boy. $50,000. A month ago, that sum would have been a lifeline, a miracle. Now measured against the impossible number locked in the vault, it was an insult. It was the price of her silence. The building is not for sale, Althea said, her voice steadier than she felt. Garrison's smile didn't falter, but a coldness entered his eyes. You are a woman in a difficult position, Ms. Washington. Homeless, a single mother. Do not mistake a fortunate coincidence for a winning lottery ticket. That building is a tomb, and my family's history with your ancestor is complicated. You do not want to involve yourself in it. Take the money. It's the smart play. The threat was veiled but unmistakable. He was not just offering to buy the property. He was warning her away from it. He was a man accustomed to getting what he wanted, to clearing obstacles with money or with pressure. I'll consider your offer, she said, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth. She needed to end this conversation, to get away from the chilling vacuum of his presence. Garrison nodded, as if she had already agreed. You have 24 hours. My attorney will be in touch. The window slid up, sealing him back in his silent, dark world. The car pulled away from the curb, leaving Althea standing on the sidewalk, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and a new, unfamiliar anger. They saw her as a nuisance, a problem to be paid off and dismissed. They had no idea what she was, who she was. They had no idea about the key, the journal, or the secret whispered in stone. When she told Vance about the encounter, his face grew grim. I had hoped we would have more time before they showed their hand, he said, his voice low. Arthur Garrison is a dangerous man. His grandfather built an empire on your great-great-uncle's genius, and they have spent 70 years bearing that truth. They see you as a loose thread in a story they have carefully woven. He looked at her, his old eyes filled with a fierce light. Their fear is your advantage. It confirms that they have something to hide. It confirms that what is inside that building is more than just money. It is a reckoning. The confrontation with Garrison solidified her resolve. This was no longer just about survival for her and Leo. It was about justice for Silas. It was about honoring the legacy of a man who had tried to print the truth in a world that preferred comfortable lies. That night she dressed in dark clothes, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She returned to the silent street, the fortress-like building looming in the darkness. The city's glow painted the clouds a sickly orange. But down here, in the canyon of forgotten industry, the shadows were deep and absolute. She found the loose brick, her fingers tracing its outline in the dark. It took several tense, agonizing minutes to work it free. Behind it was not a gaping hole, but a small, dark cavity, just big enough for her hand. Reaching inside, her fingers brushed against cold metal. A lever. She pulled. There was a low, grinding sound from below, the protest of machinery that had been asleep for generations. A section of the wall at ground level, a large panel of stone and brick that had looked seamless, receded inward by a few inches, revealing a dark, vertical gap. It was an entrance so perfectly concealed, it was almost invisible even when open. It was not a door for a person to walk through, but a crack for a shadow to slip through. Inside the cavity there was something else. A small, recessed metal plate with a keyhole in the center. It was a strange, star-shaped opening, an exact match for the iron key she carried. Her hand trembled as she inserted the key. It slid in with a smooth, satisfying click. When she turned it, there was a series of deeper, more resonant thuds from within the walls of the building itself. It was the sound of immense locking bolts being drawn back. The panel was now free to be pushed. Taking a deep breath, she put her shoulder to the cold stone and pushed. It moved with a surprising lack of resistance, swinging inward on silent, massive hinges. Before her was a maw of absolute blackness. The air that flowed out was cool and still, carrying a scent she couldn't place. Not the mustiness of decay, but something cleaner, sharper. The smell of old paper, cold metal, and a faint chemical tang of ink. It was the smell of a place perfectly preserved, a time capsule waiting to be opened. She hesitated for only a moment, the fear of the unknown warring with the promise of discovery. She thought of Leo's sleeping face. She thought of Arthur Garrison's cold smile. She thought of Silas Washington, waiting for 70 years for his heir to arrive. Armed with a small flashlight, Althea Washington, a homeless single mother with nothing to her name but a key and a ghost's legacy, stepped out of her world and into his. The heavy stone door swung shut behind her, with a soft, final boom, sealing her inside the silent, sleeping heart of the Atlas Printing Works. The darkness inside was total, a physical presence that swallowed the beam of her flashlight. The air was cold and still, the silence so profound it felt like a pressure against her eardrums. She was inside the beast, in its belly, and for a terrifying moment, she felt an overwhelming urge to push the door back open and flee into the familiar, if grim, reality of the city. But the soft click of the door sealing itself had sounded like a finality she could not undo. She was here now. She had to move forward. Her flashlight beam cut a nervous path through the gloom, revealing a narrow corridor of bare concrete. The walls were smooth, featureless, and the floor was clean. Impossibly so. There was no dust, no debris, none of the usual signs of 70 years of neglect. It was as if the building had been holding its breath. The corridor opened into a vast, cavernous space. Althea's light was a tiny firefly in a cathedral of shadows. She swept it upwards, and the beam was lost in a web of steel beams and rafters high above. She moved the light around the room, and monolithic shapes began to emerge from the darkness. They were the printing presses. Giants of iron and steel, they stood in silent rows, each one the size of a small house. They were machines from another era, a symphony of gears, levers, and rollers, all coated in a thin uniform layer of dust that softened their hard edges. They looked like sleeping titans, their immense power held in a state of suspended animation. The scale of the place was overwhelming. It was an industrial temple built to honor the power of the printed word. She walked between the silent machines, her footsteps echoing unnervingly in the vast space. The faint smell of ink was stronger here, a ghost of the millions of pages that had been born in this room. She imagined the noise, the thunderous rhythm of the presses running in unison, the shouts of the workers, the building alive and vibrating with purpose. Now its silence was its most powerful feature. She found a small office off the main press floor, its glass door still intact. Inside, a desk and chair sat as if the occupant had just stepped out for a moment. A calendar on the wall was turned to November 1948. A fountain pen lay next to a petrified inkwell. It was a scene frozen in time, a perfect, undisturbed moment of a life abruptly abandoned. She saw no signs of Silas's journals or personal effects. He had been meticulous. He would not have left them in the open. He would have secured them in the heart of his fortress, the vault. Following Vance's description and the cryptic diagrams in the journal she had seen, she knew the ink vault was located in the sub-basement. She found a heavy steel door that led to a stairwell, and as she descended, the air grew colder. The stairs ended at another corridor, this one lined with shelves holding metal canisters, likely containing raw inks and solvents, all perfectly sealed. At the end of the corridor was the vault door. Althea's breath caught in her chest. It was even more formidable than she had imagined. It was a perfect circle of polished steel, at least 10 feet in diameter, and set flush into a wall of reinforced concrete. There was no handle, no dial, no keypad, no visible hinge. Its surface was a seamless, impenetrable face of metal. It was less a door and more a statement a declaration of finality. This, she knew, was the true lock. The hidden entrance and the iron key had just been the first part of the test. Silas had designed a puzzle box on a grand architectural scale. Frustration and a sense of hopelessness began to creep in. How could she possibly open this? There was no clue, no obvious mechanism. She ran her flashlight over every inch of its surface and the surrounding wall, looking for a hidden switch, a secret panel, anything, nothing. She was so close, yet the real treasure was as far away as ever. Just then, her flashlight beam flickered and died, plunging her into an absolute disorienting blackness. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She fumbled with the light, shaking it, banging it against her palm. Nothing. She was alone in the dark, in a sealed tomb, deep beneath the city. Her breathing grew ragged, the oppressive silence amplifying her own frantic heartbeat. She forced herself to be still, to control the panic. Crying or screaming would do no good. No one would hear her. She had to think. She had to be like Silas. Calm, meticulous. She retraced her steps in her mind, back up the stairs, through the press hall, to the hidden door. Could she open it from the inside? She had to try. Groping her way along the wall, she started back down the corridor, her hands outstretched, shuffling her feet to avoid tripping. It was slow, terrifying work. Every small sound was magnified. Every brush against the cold concrete sent a shiver through her. After what felt like an eternity, her hand found the doorframe to the stairwell. She felt her way up the steps, her sense of relief so profound it almost made her weak. She emerged onto the main press floor, the vast emptiness of the hall somehow even more intimidating in the total darkness. She oriented herself by the memory of the layout, moving slowly toward where she remembered the office was. Her hand eventually found the glass of its door. She felt her way inside, found the desk, and ran her hands over its surface. Her fingers brushed against a metal object, a desk lamp, old with a pull chain. On a desperate whim, she pulled it. Nothing. Of course not. The building's power had been cut for 70 years. Defeated, she slumped into the chair, the petrified wood groaning under her weight. The silence returned, deeper than before. This was it. She had failed. She had breached the walls only to be trapped inside. And then she heard it. A faint, rhythmic sound. Drip, drip, drip. It was coming from a corner of the office. A leak? After all this time? It seemed impossible in this perfectly preserved place. Curiosity overriding her fear, she felt her way toward the sound. Her hands found a metal filing cabinet. The sound was coming from behind it. She pulled at it, the metal legs scraping loudly against the concrete floor. Behind it, a small, dark stain marred the wall, and near the floor, a metal plate was set into the concrete, barely visible in the gloom that her eyes were slowly adjusting to. In the center of the plate was a small, recessed button. It wasn't a water leak. It was a sound, a deliberate mechanical dripping designed to draw attention. It was another clue. Her finger hovered over the button, a fresh wave of fear and hope washing over her. What would happen when she pressed it? Would it open the vault? Trigger a trap? Or was it simply the next step in the elaborate test left by her ancestor? There was only one way to find out. She closed her eyes, took a shaky breath, and pressed the button. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a low hum started, vibrating up through the concrete floor. A single small light flickered on above the vault door in the basement, a soft green glow in the oppressive darkness. And from the heart of the largest printing press in the center of the hall, a soft, mechanical whirring began, the sound of a great heart stirring from a long, long sleep. The low hum was a living thing, a pulse that resonated deep in Althea's bones. It was not the sudden, jarring noise of a generator kicking to life, but a slow, deliberate awakening. The single green light she could now faintly see, glowing from the basement stairwell, was a beacon, pulling her back down into the depths of the building. As she descended the stairs again, she saw that the light emanated from a small, newly illuminated panel right beside the vault door. It hadn't been there before, or at least it hadn't been visible. Pressing the button in the office had activated some kind of auxiliary power system, a hidden lifeblood Silas had built into the very walls of his creation. The panel contained a single large lever, currently in the off position, and a series of gauges, their needles all resting at 0. Below the lever was a small brass plate, and etched into it were the words, "Main Drive Engagement." This was the switch to power the colossal machines on the floor above. She felt a surge of understanding. The vault door wasn't opened by a key or a combination. It was opened by the building itself. The printing presses were the lock's mechanism. It was an idea so audacious, so brilliantly insane, that she could only marvel at the mind that had conceived it. Silas hadn't just built a vault. He had built a ceremony, a ritual of resurrection. To gain the inheritance, his heir had to bring his life's work back from the dead. But the challenge was immense. These were not simple machines. They were complex industrial behemoths from a bygone era. Starting them would not be a simple matter of flipping a switch. It would require a specific sequence, a precise understanding of their function. Rushing would be disastrous. A wrong move could seize the gears, destroy the delicate mechanisms, and lock the vault forever. She needed the instructions. She needed Silas's journals, the real ones. She returned to the press hall, her eyes now more accustomed to the faint ambient light filtering down from somewhere high above, perhaps a cleverly disguised skylight. The central press, the one that was humming softly, was the largest of them all, the Atlas Prime, as it was labeled on a brass plate on its side. It was the heart of the operation. She began a systematic search of the machine, running her hands over its cold iron body, looking for any hidden compartment or panel. It felt like searching a metal whale for a secret. At its base, near the massive flywheel, she found a small, recessed handle she had overlooked before. It opened a maintenance hatch, and inside, nestled among the pristine, well-oiled gears, was a heavy lead-lined box. Her breath hitched. She lifted it out. It was heavy, sealed with a simple latch. She opened it, and inside, protected from time and moisture, were 3 more leather-bound journals and a set of rolled-up schematics. These were the keys. She sat on the floor, the faint light from the basement catching the edges of the pages as she opened the first journal. The script was the same elegant, dense hand she had seen in Vance's office. But these were not philosophical musings. They were technical manuals, operating instructions of an almost fanatical detail. Silas had documented everything, from the precise mixture of lubricating oils to the exact tension required for the drive belts. He wrote of the presses as if they were living creatures, each with its own temperament, its own voice. And on the last few pages of the final journal, she found it, a chapter titled The Guardian's Protocol. It was the sequence for opening the vault. It was a symphony of mechanics. She had to engage the clutch of the Atlas Prime, then use its flywheel to manually start the smaller press to its left, which in turn powered a pneumatic system that fed the third press, and so on, a chain reaction of awakening giants. Each step had to be performed in perfect order, each lever pulled, each wheel turned at the precise moment. It was a test not of strength, but of patience, precision, and a deep intuitive understanding of the machinery. It was a test of an heir's worthiness. As she absorbed the information, a new, more immediate threat made itself known. A low, rhythmic booming sound started from far away, from the world outside. Thump, thump, thump. It was the sound of metal hitting metal. She ran to the hidden entrance and listened. The sound was coming from the main welded doors. Someone was trying to break in. The garrisons. They must have seen her enter. Or perhaps their patience had simply run out. The leisurely thumping suggested they weren't using heavy equipment yet, just a sledgehammer, testing the welds, announcing their presence. It was a threat, a ticking clock. They would get more serious. Soon they would bring cutting torches, hydraulic rams. She had hours, maybe a day at most, before they breached the outer shell. The pressure was immense. She had to work faster than she wanted, but she couldn't afford a single mistake. With the journals and schematics spread out on the floor, lit by the green glow from the basement, she began. She returned to the sub-basement and with a deep breath, threw the main drive engagement lever. The hum intensified, and the needles on the gauges quivered to life, indicating power flow and pressure. The building was now alive, its nervous system energized. Back on the press floor, a series of small indicator lights on the Atlas Prime were now glowing. Following the journal's instructions, she located the main clutch lever. It was massive, requiring all her weight to pull it down. With a great groan of metal, the gears engaged. The press didn't start, but it was now connected to the power source, ready. The next step was the most physically demanding. She had to manually turn the flywheel to begin the machine's cycle. It was a wheel of solid iron, 10 feet tall. A steel handle was folded into its side for this exact purpose. She grabbed it, planting her feet, and pulled. It didn't budge. It was like trying to move a mountain. Panic began to prickle at her again. She was not strong enough. This was a task for a team of burly pressmen, not for her. Despair washed over her. She had come so far, solved the riddles, only to be defeated by a simple lack of physical strength. She slumped against the cold iron of the wheel, her body trembling with exertion and frustration. Her eyes fell upon a diagram in the journal she had left open on the floor. It showed the flywheel, but it also showed a smaller, secondary lever near the base of the machine, labeled inertial release. She had missed it. It was a brake, a locking mechanism. She scrambled to the base of the press, found the lever, and pulled it. It shifted with a loud, satisfying clank. She returned to the flywheel, grabbed the handle, and pulled again. This time, with a low, deep groan, it moved. It was incredibly heavy, but it moved. Inch by agonizing inch, she forced the giant wheel to turn, her muscles screaming in protest. The sounds of the assault on the outer door were growing louder, more frantic. They were getting impatient. She ignored it, focusing all her being on the task, on the rhythm of the turning wheel. Push, breathe, step. Push, breathe, step. After a full rotation, something clicked deep within the machine. The low hum from the motor took over, and the flywheel began to turn on its own, slowly at first, then picking up speed. The Atlas Prime was waking up. The first giant was stirring. The floor beneath her feet began to vibrate, a gentle tremor that spread through the entire building. The sound was magnificent, a deep, rhythmic chuffing and whirring, the sound of power and purpose. 1 down, 5 to go. The race against the garrisons had begun. The rhythmic, thunderous heartbeat of the Atlas Prime filled the cavernous hall, a sound of immense and ancient power. It was a baseline, a foundation upon which she had to build a mechanical symphony. The air, once still and dead, now thrummed with energy, and the floor vibrated with a steady, reassuring pulse. The sound of the assault from outside seemed to fade, dwarfed by the magnificent roar of the resurrected machine. Althea, covered in a fine sheen of sweat and grease, consulted the next page of Silas's journal. The revived Atlas Prime was now powering a series of drive belts that snaked across the ceiling to the adjacent press, a smaller but still formidable machine called the Journeyman. Her task was to engage its clutch, but only after the Prime reached a specific rotational speed, which she had to measure using a revolutions per minute gauge on its side. That was, of course, entirely analog. She watched the needle on the brass dial climb, her eyes darting between the gauge and the journal, a diagram of which showed the precise point on the dial where she had to act. The needle crept higher. 70, 80, 85. The journal specified 90 RPMs exactly. Any sooner and the belt would snap. Any later and the Prime's engine would be strained. The needle touched the line for 90. Now. She ran to the Journeyman and threw a lever that was almost as stiff as the first. There was a screech of leather on iron and a high-pitched whine as the Journeyman's own massive flywheel began to turn, sluggishly at first, then catching the rhythm of the Prime. The roar in the hall deepened, harmonizing into a two-tone chorus of industrial might. The building shook more violently now, the vibrations no longer a gentle tremor, but a deep, resonant shudder. Dust shook loose from the high rafters, drifting down like ancient snow in the dim light. 2 down. The process repeated, each press a new verse in the song. The third machine, the regulator, was not powered by a belt, but by a pneumatic system fed by the Journeyman. She had to open a series of valves in a precise sequence, listening for the hiss of compressed air, watching pressure gauges, bleeding the lines of air that had been trapped for 70 years. It was delicate work, more like surgery than mechanics. A mistake here could blow a line, rendering the entire system useless. The thumping from outside had stopped. For a moment, Althea felt a sliver of hope that they had given up. The hope was shattered by a new sound, a high-pitched, piercing scream of metal on metal. A cutting torch. They were cutting through the welded steel door. The sound was a violation, a surgical incision into the skin of her sanctuary. It spurred her on. She worked faster, her movements economical and sure, her earlier hesitation replaced by a desperate, focused clarity. She was no longer just following instructions. She was beginning to understand the logic of the system, to feel the flow of power from one machine to the next as an intuitive, tangible thing. She was a conductor, and this was her orchestra. The fourth and fifth presses came online, each one adding its unique voice to the crescendo, the percussive clank of the typesetter, the steady shush of the paper feeder. The hall was now a deafening, exhilarating tempest of coordinated motion. The air was thick with the smell of warm oil and ionized air. Light panels, powered by the machines themselves, began to flicker on overhead, illuminating the grand, chaotic ballet of the machinery in a stark, industrial glow. Finally, it was time for the last press, the finisher. According to the journal, this machine did not contribute to the power chain. Its purpose was singular. Once it was running, it completed a circuit, a final electronic handshake that would signal the vault to open. As she approached it, she saw something that made her blood run cold. One of the main drive gears on the finisher was shattered. A gaping hole with jagged teeth grinned out at her from the heart of the mechanism. It was the one part of this perfectly preserved system that was broken. Sabotage? A failure of the metal over time? It didn't matter. The sequence was broken. The circuit could not be completed. The vault would remain sealed. Despair, sharp and absolute, crashed over her. To have come this far, to have awakened the giants and learned their language, only to be defeated by a single broken cog. The scream of the cutting torch from outside was louder now, a mocking shriek of imminent failure. She could almost smell the burning metal. They would be through soon. She slumped against the silent machine, her body limp with defeat. Her eyes scanned the room, the 5 other presses churning and roaring in a magnificent, pointless display of power. Her gaze fell on the schematics, still laid out on the floor. There was a detail she had overlooked, a secondary diagram showing an alternate power source for the finisher. A manual crank system designed for maintenance and calibration. It was labeled emergency override. It would be slow. It would be grueling. But it might just work. The override was a large capstan-style wheel with 4 spokes. It was designed for a team of men. She would have to do it alone. With a cry of desperate resolve, she grabbed one of the spokes and threw her entire body into it. The mechanism was stiff, frozen with decades of disuse. For a moment, nothing happened. She pushed again, a raw, guttural sob escaping her lips. It moved, a fraction of an inch, with a sound like tearing metal. She pushed again, and again. It was a battle for every single inch of rotation. The noise from the front of the building was changing. The torch had stopped. Now there was a new sound, a powerful, rhythmic groaning, a hydraulic ram. They were prying the cut steel apart. She was out of time. She ignored the fire in her muscles, the pain in her back. She focused on the wheel, on the rhythm. Heave, release, heave, release. A small green light on the finisher's control panel flickered. It needed 1 full rotation to complete the circuit. She was halfway there. She could hear shouting from the front of the building now, muffled but clear. They were close. The gap in the door must be widening. With a final, desperate surge of adrenaline, she threw herself against the spoke one last time. The wheel completed its rotation. There was a loud, solid clunk from deep within the finisher. The green light on its panel turned from flickering to a steady, solid glow. The circuit was complete. For a second, nothing happened. The 5 presses continued their thunderous song. Then a new sound joined the chorus, a low, deep grinding that seemed to come from the very foundations of the building. It was the sound of geology shifting. She scrambled to the railing overlooking the sub-basement. The seamless, circular steel door of the ink vault was rotating. Slowly, majestically, the massive disc of metal was retracting into the concrete wall, revealing a dark, silent opening. It was open. The vault was open. Just as the sound of the main door being torn from its hinges echoed up from the front of the building, a crash of tortured metal that signaled the final breach. They were in. Althea stood frozen between the roaring, triumphant machines of her ancestor and the dark, silent promise of the vault, the shouts of the invaders echoing behind her. She had won the race, but her prize was to be cornered in the heart of the maze. The triumphant roar of the presses was now a terrifying backdrop to the harsh, immediate sounds of the invasion. Heavy footsteps echoed from the front of the building, accompanied by the gruff, excited voices of men who had just breached a fortress. They were coming for her. Althea didn't hesitate. She scrambled down the stairs to the sub-basement, her heart hammering against her ribs. The vault door was fully retracted, a perfect circle of darkness waiting for her. She plunged inside, not even pausing to see what it contained, and fumbled along the interior wall, praying Silas had included a way to close it from the inside. Her fingers found a recessed panel, and inside a single large button. She slammed her palm against it. With the same slow, grinding majesty, the massive steel disc began to emerge from the wall, sliding back into place. The shouts from the press hall grew louder, closer. She saw flashlights cutting through the dust-filled air at the top of the stairs. "In here! Down here!" a voice yelled. The gap of the closing door narrowed. A man appeared at the top of the stairs, a large figure in dark tactical gear. He raised a heavy flashlight, its beam pinning her against the far wall of the vault. For a heart-stopping second, their eyes met. Then the door sealed with a deep, resonant boom that vibrated through her entire body, followed by a series of heavy clicks as the locking bolts shot home. She was plunged into absolute darkness and silence. The thunder of the presses, the shouts of the men, the entire world was gone, shut out by a foot of solid steel. She was safe, and she was trapped. Her breathing was ragged, coming in harsh, painful gasps. She leaned against the cold, smooth wall, her legs trembling too much to support her. The silence in the vault was as profound and absolute as the darkness. It was a silence that felt ancient, holy. After a few moments, her panic began to subside, replaced by a dawning sense of awe and trepidation. She was in the heart of it all, the sanctum sanctorum. Using the faint light from her phone's screen, she cast a weak glow around her. The vault was not what she had expected. It was not a room piled high with gold bars or stacks of cash. It was a library, a meticulously organized archive. The circular room was lined with floor-to-ceiling shelves made of dark, polished wood. On the shelves were not books, but hundreds of identical leather-bound ledgers and stacks of thick, archival-quality paper. In the center of the room, on a series of climate-controlled glass-top pedestals, were the source of the immense monetary value. Cases filled with bearer bonds from the pre-war era, issued by governments and corporations that were now titans of the global economy. Stacks of stock certificates for companies like IBM, General Electric, and others, bought for pennies in the depths of the Depression. Deeds to vast tracts of land in areas that were now sprawling suburbs and thriving commercial centers. It was a portfolio of staggering genius, a testament to Silas's foresight. A quick tally of the face values of the bonds alone confirmed the number Vance had quoted. It was all here. $529 million in tangible, negotiable assets. Enough money to change the world, or at least to change her and Leo's world so completely it would be unrecognizable. But as she moved the faint light of her phone across the room, she realized the bonds were only part of the inheritance. The real treasure was on the shelves. She pulled down one of the heavy ledgers. Its cover was stamped with a single name, Garrison. She opened it. Inside, in Silas's precise, elegant script, was a detailed accounting of Alistair Garrison's betrayal. Photostatic copies of stolen patents, sworn affidavits from employees who had been silenced, a meticulous paper trail that documented the theft of Silas's intellectual property, the very foundation of the Garrison global empire. He hadn't just been angry. He had been a forensic archivist of his own destruction. He had gathered proof. Another ledger detailed the corrupt dealings of a city councilman who had tried to seize Silas's property in the 1940s. Another exposed a federal judge who was in the pocket of a railroad tycoon. On and on it went, shelf after shelf of carefully documented corruption, greed, and abuse of power. These were the stories he never got to print, the truths he had unearthed that were too dangerous to publish. He hadn't hidden his wealth here. He had hidden his weapon. The ink for his press was not just for making money, it was for printing truth. The name of the vault, the Ink Vault, was a literal description. This was his ink, his ammunition, a lifetime of it, stored and waiting. A sudden, heavy thud against the vault door jolted her back to the present. They were trying to get in. Another thud, louder this time. They would be relentless, but the door was designed to withstand a direct assault. Silas had made sure of that. They would not get through, not with force. She was safe for now. As she stood in the silent, hallowed space, the enormity of her situation settled upon her. She was in possession of two things: a fortune that could give her and her son a life of unimaginable ease and security, and a truth so powerful it could dismantle one of the country's most powerful corporate dynasties and expose the rot at the core of the city's history. The choice was hers. She could find a way out, cash the bonds, and disappear. She could take Leo far away from shelters and sirens, give him the best of everything, and never look back. Who would blame her? She owed this city, this world, nothing. It had given her nothing but hardship. Or she could fulfill the legacy of the man who had built this place. She could use the truth as he had intended, as a weapon. She could finish the job he had started 70 years ago. It was a choice between a life of quiet, wealthy obscurity and a life of profound, dangerous purpose. A choice between herself and a legacy. She looked at the evidence against the Garrisons. She thought of Arthur Garrison's cold, dismissive smile, his assumption that she could be bought off, that her poverty made her weak and insignificant. He had no idea who her family was. He had no idea what they were capable of. Outside, the banging on the door continued, a futile, angry rhythm against the unyielding steel. They were trapped out there in the world of noise and violence. She was in here, in the silent heart of the truth. The printing presses were still running. The giants were awake and waiting for their master. Althea Washington, a woman who had lost everything, now held the power to remake her world. She closed the ledger, a new cold resolve settling over her. The decision had been made the moment she saw the proof of the Garrison's crimes. Silas hadn't left her a fortune. He had left her a responsibility. The banging on the vault door eventually subsided, replaced by an unnerving silence. Althea knew they hadn't given up. They were likely regrouping, strategizing, perhaps bringing in specialists or heavier equipment. The silence was not a reprieve. It was the quiet before a more calculated storm. She, in turn, used the time to strategize. The choice was made, but the path forward was fraught with peril. She couldn't simply walk out and hand the ledgers to the authorities. The Garrison's influence ran deep. The evidence could be buried, dismissed, or even turned against her. Silas had understood that. He hadn't built a library, he had built an armory. And he had left the weapon, the printing press, primed and ready. She had to use the power of the press, just as he would have. Her plan began to form, a desperate and audacious gambit. She needed to get the story out, not to the police or the courts, but to the people. She needed a single, undeniable document, a folio of truth so damning it could not be ignored. She needed to print it herself. Using her phone, which thankfully still had a nearly full battery, she began to meticulously photograph the most critical pages from the Garrison ledger. The stolen patents, the falsified incorporation documents, the sworn affidavit from a former Garrison employee detailing the theft. The quality was not perfect, but it was legible. It was proof. The next challenge was getting out of the vault. The button to open it from the inside was right there, but the moment she did, she would be facing Garrison's men. She needed a distraction, a way to draw them away from the basement. Her eyes scanned the vault, looking for anything she could use. On a shelf dedicated to technical manuals, she found a complete set of blueprints for the entire building. She unrolled them on the floor. They were a marvel of detail, showing not just the architecture, but the electrical conduits, the plumbing, the pneumatic lines. And then she saw it, a secondary control panel for the building's core systems, located in a small maintenance closet on the opposite side of the press hall. The panel included a circuit breaker for the main lighting and, more importantly, an emergency release valve for the entire pneumatic system. If she could get to it, she could create chaos. Opening the vault would be a calculated risk. She had to assume they had men posted right outside the door, but they would be expecting her to be afraid, to be trapped. They would not be expecting a counterattack. She took a deep breath, placed her hand on the button, and pressed it. The grinding sound began again as the massive door started to retract. She didn't wait for it to open fully. As soon as the gap was wide enough for her to slip through, she squeezed out and ran, not up the stairs, but deeper into the sub-basement, following a narrow maintenance corridor shown on the blueprints. "She's out! Get her!" The shout came from behind her, followed by the thunder of footsteps on the metal stairs. They had been waiting. She plunged into the darkness of the corridor, her phone's light bouncing wildly ahead of her. The corridor twisted, and she took a sharp right, then a left, navigating by the memory of the blueprint. She could hear them crashing through the basement behind her, their powerful flashlights cutting through the gloom. They were spreading out, searching. She found the stairs she was looking for, a steep, narrow spiral staircase hidden behind a boiler. It was a service route, not meant for regular use. She scrambled up it, emerging into the deafening roar of the press hall, but far from the main staircase behind the massive paper stores. The air was thick with the smell of warm machinery. The five giants continued their relentless, churning dance. She peered through a gap in the towering rolls of newsprint. Three men in dark gear were methodically sweeping the main floor, their movements professional and coordinated. A fourth was directing them, a man in a sharp suit. It was Arthur Garrison's son, the impatient young man from the car. The father was not here. He had sent his heir to do the dirty work. She crept along the back wall, using the immense machines as cover, their thunderous noise masking her footsteps. She found the maintenance closet. The door was unlocked. Inside was a wall of levers and switches, exactly as the blueprint had shown. She found the main lighting breaker and flipped it. The overhead lights that had flickered to life died, plunging the hall into a confusing patchwork of shadows and the faint glow from the machines themselves. The men shouted in surprise. Then she found the pneumatic release valve. It was a large red wheel. The diagram warned that its release would be sudden and violent. She gripped it with both hands and turned. The effect was instantaneous. A deafening roar, louder than the presses, erupted as every pneumatic line in the building vented at once. High-pressure air blasted from valves and joints, kicking up a hurricane of dust and debris. Loose papers flew through the air like frightened birds. The men were thrown into confusion, blinded by the dust, their shouts lost in the screaming hiss of the escaping air. This was her chance. While they were disoriented, she sprinted from the closet toward the Atlas Prime. She had to prepare it to print. The process of creating a printing plate from her phone's images would be impossible. But Silas, the ultimate planner, had left a solution. In the journal, he described a process for emergency typesetting, using a special press bed on the Atlas Prime that could take direct imprints. It was an archaic method, but it would work. She found the emergency tray and a box of what looked like thick, waxy carbon paper. She had to arrange the sheets on the press bed, then use a series of metal blocks, letters, to manually stamp the key phrases: stolen patents, fraudulent foundation, testimony of Thomas Reed. It was crude, but it would be powerful. As she worked, a hand clamped down on her shoulder. She cried out, spinning around to face one of Garrison's men. He was huge, his face grim in the swirling dust. She reacted on pure instinct, grabbing a heavy steel wrench from the press's tool bench and swinging it with all her might. It connected with his knee with a sickening crack. The man roared in pain and collapsed. She didn't wait to see more. She finished her crude typesetting, her hands trembling. She had the words. Now she needed the paper. She activated the paper feed, and a thick sheet of archival paper slid into place. The final step was to engage the press itself. It was the moment of creation, the moment of truth. She pulled the lever. The massive press cylinder rolled forward, pressing the paper against her makeshift plate with tons of force. It was done. One copy, one perfect, damning piece of evidence, hot off the press. She grabbed the sheet as it emerged, the ink still smelling fresh and sharp. At that moment, the younger Garrison and the two remaining men cornered her, their flashlights pinning her against the side of the great machine. "It's over," Garrison said, his voice laced with triumph. "Give it to me." Althea looked at the folio in her hand, then at the sneering face of the man whose family had built an empire on lies. She shook her head. "It's not for you," she said, and with a speed she didn't know she possessed, she turned and fed the sheet into a pneumatic tube system built into the wall of the press, a system Silas had once used to send proofs to his office. She had seen it on the blueprints. It had one destination, a delivery chute on the outside of the building, disguised as a drain pipe. Garrison's face contorted in fury as he heard the hiss of the tube. He lunged for her, but it was too late. The truth was out. The folio shot through the pneumatic tube, a silent messenger on a mission 70 years in the making. For a moment, everyone in the press hall was frozen. Althea, breathless against the side of the Atlas Prime, and the three men, their expressions a mixture of shock and fury. The younger Garrison was the first to recover, his face pale with rage. He took a step toward her, his hand raised, but then seemed to think better of it. Physical violence against her was now a liability. The evidence was out of his control. "What have you done?" he hissed, his voice trembling with a mixture of anger and fear. "Where did you send it?" Althea didn't answer. She could feel the vibrations of the presses through the floor, a steady, powerful rhythm that felt like her own strength and heartbeat. The giants she had awakened were her protectors now, their thunderous noise a shield. "It doesn't matter," Garrison said, trying to regain his composure. He pulled out a phone. "It's one piece of paper. We'll find it. We'll destroy it. We'll destroy you." But there was a new sound now, a distant but unmistakable chorus of sirens growing steadily closer. Someone must have reported the assault on the building, the sounds of the ram and the cutting torch. The outside world was finally coming to them. Garrison heard it too. Panic flickered in his eyes. He and his men were here illegally, armed and engaged in a clear criminal conspiracy. He looked from Althea to the exit, his mind racing. He made his choice. "Get the ledgers from the vault," he snapped at his men. "All of them. Burn them. Burn everything." His men hesitated, glancing nervously toward the sound of the approaching sirens. "Now!" he roared. As his men ran toward the sub-basement, Garrison turned back to Althea, a look of pure venom in his eyes. "My father will ruin you," he promised. "You will wish you had taken the money." He then turned and fled, disappearing into the shadows of the press hall, presumably toward a different exit. Althea didn't try to stop him. Her mission was accomplished. She slid to the floor, her back against the warm iron of the press, the adrenaline that had sustained her finally draining away, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. The sirens grew louder, converging on the building. Soon the hall was filled with flashing red and blue lights, casting long, dancing shadows of the great machines. Police officers in tactical gear swarmed in, their weapons drawn, shouting commands. They found her there, a lone woman in grease-stained clothes, sitting calmly amidst the deafening roar of the resurrected printing presses. The scene was so surreal, so inexplicable, that they could only stare. The story unraveled quickly after that. The folio she had printed was found by the first responding officer, nestled in the external delivery chute just as she had planned. It was immediately recognized as evidence. When the police descended into the sub-basement, they found Garrison's two men frantically trying to set fire to the contents of the vault. They were arrested on the spot. Arthur Garrison and his son were apprehended hours later, trying to board a private jet out of the country. The ledgers, the bonds, the deeds, the entire contents of the ink vault were seized and placed under federal protection. Elias Vance, armed with Silas Washington's will and a power of attorney Althea had signed, became her fierce and brilliant advocate. The media frenzy was instantaneous and all-consuming. The story of the homeless single mother, the eccentric recluse, the sealed printing press, and the secret history of one of the nation's most powerful families was irresistible. It was a modern myth, a David and Goliath tale for the digital age. Althea found herself at the center of a storm, but Vance shielded her from the worst of it. He handled the press, the lawyers, the federal investigators. He allowed her to do the one thing she needed to do most: go to the temporary daycare, pick up her son, and hold him in her arms. In the quiet of a hotel room paid for by the burgeoning estate, she held Leo as he slept, and she finally allowed herself to weep. Tears not of sorrow or fear, but of release. The fire that had taken her home felt like a lifetime ago. It had been a baptism, a trial that had burned away her old life to make way for the impossible weight and promise of her new one. The legal battles were complex and protracted, but the evidence Silas had collected was irrefutable. Garrison Global's stock plummeted. The board ousted the family. Arthur and his son faced a mountain of federal charges, from conspiracy and breaking and entering to tax evasion and securities fraud, based on the company's fraudulent origins. The Garrison empire, built on a 70-year-old lie, crumbled under the weight of a single sheet of paper printed in a forgotten factory. The city, faced with a public relations nightmare and proof of its own historical complicity, quietly dropped its tax liens against the Atlas Printing Works. The building was hers, free and clear. The courts eventually unfroze a portion of the estate's liquid assets, and one crisp autumn morning, Elias Vance presented Althea with a cashier's check. The number written on it was still so large it seemed unreal, but it was hers. The first thing she did was buy a small, simple house in a quiet neighborhood with a yard and a strong, sturdy oak tree. A place where Leo could run and play, a place that could never be taken from them. For weeks, she did nothing but revel in the simple, profound joy of domesticity. She cooked meals in her own kitchen, planted flowers in her own garden, and read to Leo in a comfortable armchair that was entirely their own. She healed. But the building, the source of it all, still stood silent in the industrial heart of the city. The presses had been powered down, the vault sealed once more, this time by federal marshals. It called to her. It was more than just a source of wealth. It was her legacy, her responsibility. She was not Silas's heir just to become a wealthy recluse like him. He had left her a tool, and he had trusted her to use it. She knew what she had to do. It was not enough to expose a lie. She had to build a new truth. 10 years passed. The city changed, as cities do. Neighborhoods shifted, skylines altered. But in the old industrial sector, a beacon of light and purpose now stood where a derelict fortress once slept. The Atlas Printing Works was no longer a tomb. It was alive. Althea Washington, with the guidance of Elias Vance and a board of trustees she had handpicked, had not sold the building. She had not demolished it for a quick profit. She had restored it. The soot-stained bricks were cleaned, the bricked-up windows replaced with great panes of glass that flooded the interior with natural light. The welded steel door was gone, replaced by a welcoming entrance of glass and steel. The building was now the home of the Silas Washington Foundation for Journalistic Truth. The 5 great presses on the main floor, the ones Althea had awakened on that terrifying night, were now the centerpiece of a working museum, lovingly restored and maintained. They were run several times a day by skilled artisans, printing limited edition books and pamphlets. Their thunderous roar no longer a sound of desperation, but a celebration of history and craft. The rest of the vast hall had been converted into a state-of-the-art facility. It housed the Foundation's offices, a research library, and most importantly, a heavily subsidized workspace for independent journalists, documentary filmmakers, and investigative reporters. The Foundation provided grants, legal support, and a platform for those who, like Silas, were dedicated to unearthing the uncomfortable truths that power sought to conceal. Althea never touched the principal of the $529 million. It remained in a trust managed by Vance, its interest funding the Foundation's work in perpetuity. She had used a small fraction of the estate to secure her family's future, but she lived modestly, choosing purpose over opulence. She was not a public figure. She rarely gave interviews, preferring to let the work of the Foundation speak for itself. But to those who knew her, she was a figure of quiet strength and unwavering moral clarity. She was the guardian of Silas's legacy, the woman who had not just inherited a fortune, but had understood its true meaning. On a bright, clear afternoon, Althea stood on a balcony overlooking the main hall. The presses were running, their familiar rhythm a comforting backdrop. Below, the space bustled with activity. Journalists huddled over laptops, filmmakers reviewed footage, and a group of school children were watching in wide-eyed wonder as an old pressman demonstrated how the journeyman worked. She was no longer the haunted, desperate woman from the shelter. Her face had a calm, confident set to it, her eyes reflecting a deep and abiding sense of peace. The phantom smell of smoke was long gone, replaced by the familiar, pleasant scent of ink and paper. A young man came to stand beside her. He was 18 now, tall and thoughtful, with the same kind eyes as his mother. Leo. "It's a good crowd today," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. "The exhibit on the Garrison archives is popular." "The truth always is," Althea said, a small smile touching her lips. Eventually. Leo had grown up in the shadow of this incredible story, but Althea had worked hard to give him a normal life. He understood the weight of their family's history, but he was not burdened by it. He was studying history and law at the local university, and he spent his summers interning at the foundation. He was his mother's son, but he also had the meticulous, curious spirit of his ancestor. "Mr. Vance called," Leo said. "The city council approved the historical landmark designation. No one will ever be able to tear this place down now." Althea nodded, a wave of profound satisfaction washing over her. The final piece was in place. The fortress was now officially a protected treasure. "Your great-great-great-uncle would be proud," Leo said softly. "I think he would be," Althea agreed. She thought of Silas, the brilliant, broken man who had retreated from the world, who had placed his faith in a future he would never see, in an heir he would never know. He had built a vessel, filled it with truth, and cast it adrift on the sea of time, hoping that one day someone worthy would find it. He had not hoped for a warrior or a tycoon. He had hoped for a guardian, someone who understood that the greatest wealth is not the money you hoard, but the legacy you build. Someone who knew that the most powerful thing you can ever print is the truth. Althea looked out over the hall at the people working, learning, and creating. The foundation had already funded dozens of projects that had exposed corruption, given voice to the marginalized, and held the powerful to account. The ripples of her decision on that fateful night were spreading out into the world, changing it in small but meaningful ways. The fire had taken everything from her, reducing her life to ash. But from those ashes, she had risen. She had walked into the darkness, faced down her fears, and brought a great and powerful engine of truth back to life. She was no longer a victim of circumstance. She was a creator of it. She was Althea Washington, and this was her press. This was her truth. And it was a legacy that would be printed in indelible ink for generations to come.